That brings us to our final portion of the conference. We're going to move into the protecting land for agriculture. Before I introduce Alex O'Hara, the moderator for the panel, and the panel members, Joshua McFadgen, John Turvey, Crystal Fuller, and Tracy Wade. Alex is a land use planner with the PEI provincial government with the Department of Housing, Land and Communities. Alex graduated with integrated Master's of Science degree in Planning and Property Development from the Ulster University in Northern Ireland. He also has contributed to the soon-to-be-released State of the Island report, the PEI State of the Coast report, and will be involved in the upcoming provincial land use plan. Dr. Josh McFadgen is an associate professor and Canadian Research Chair in Geospatial Humanities at the University of Prince Edward Island. His research focuses on food and energy transitions in Canada. His most recent book, Time Flies, A History of Prince Edward Island from the Air, looks at the changing landscapes of PEI in the last 80 years. Another of his books, Flax Americana, A History of the Fiber and Oil that's covered a continent, with the finalist for the Governor General's History Award. He has also co-edited a book in 2016 called Time and Place, An Environmental History of Prince Edward Island. He grew up on a beef farm in Hazel Grove and now lives in Winslow with his wife Colleen and 4 kids. John Turvey has been practicing land use planner for more than 25 years. He has a bachelor degree in geography, urban development from the University of Western, and master's degree in urban and regional planning from Queen's. He began his career at OMAFRA as a rural planner, a rural community advisor, and land use policy advisor. Since March 2021, he has been senior policy advisor in the land use policy and stewardship unit of OMAFRA. He has worked on a variety of provincial land use planning initiatives, including the Greenbelt Plan, review of the provincial policy statement, and review of the minimum distance separation formula. Crystal Fuller, a seasoned municipal professional, owns and operates Brighter Community Planning and Consulting in Windsor, Nova Scotia. Crystal has played a pivotal role in shaping agriculture policy in different municipal settings, showcasing her commitment to integrated agriculture policies into municipal development strategies, her dedication to fostering sustainable community development, advancing agriculture policy, and leading her consulting firm all lead back to her understanding on how people live and work in rural environments and her agriculture roots. Tracy Wade has more than 20 years of professional planning experience in primary rural communities, managing wide ranges of planning initiatives in areas of climate change, recreation, land use, and sustainability. As an independent consultant, Tracy recently worked with the government of New Brunswick to create a user guide for the provincial's new Statement of Public Interest, including statements to protect prime agriculture areas. She is currently working with the New Brunswick Department of Agriculture to train staff on the link between agriculture and land use planning. I will welcome them to the front.
Do you want us, Alex? I'd sit closest to the podium here, this way. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. My name is Alex O'Hara, as mentioned, from the Department of Housing, Land and Communities. I just want to firstly thank the organizers for the opportunity to moderate this session, and importantly, the speakers for being with us today and giving us their time. I think we're going to allot 20 minutes each and keep the questions to the end, if that's okay. John Turvey has to leave quite promptly after the presentation, so if you could prioritize questions to John first, that would be great. With that being said, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Professor Joshua McFadgen. Please join me.
Well, after that, I think we have to start by saying, now for something completely different. That was really interesting, but this is interesting, I hope, in a very different way. So this talk is, and what comes out of it, thoughts about protecting land and lessons from land, comes out of my new book, Time Flies, which isn't just what happens when you take a watch on the plane. It's actually what happens when you're trying to get a book done. Just time goes by so fast. Took me a long time. But the idea is that it's a history of Prince Edward Island from the air. And so it's a book based on aerial photography. And we're pretty rich with that in PEI's history of aerial photography and flight. So like I said, it's a little bit different, but like I'd say to my kids, just try to have a good altitude about it. Yes, all right. You hear about that new show about the airplane where the pilot crashes? Couldn't get into the first episode. The pilot was terrible. Alex, why do stormtroopers make the best pilots? From Star Wars, stormtroopers, they can't hit anything. Sorry. It's easy to write a good book, hard to land a good plane joke. Oh, wow, wake up, guys, come on. Oh dear. But agriculture matters to me, and I'm excited to be back at the Soil and Crop Association, Improvement Association. It matters to me a lot. I've come from an agricultural background, and grew up on the farm, and as a historian, it kind of occurred to me that I'd probably be the first McFadgen in maybe 500 years in my lineage to not farm. That's a big deal. Yeah, you've got the same idea, right? But in my direct family, my father farmed and I grew up on a farm, but this is what brings us to today, where 3% of Canadians farm and 100% of Canadians eat, but not too many of them know much about agriculture, present or past. So the interesting thing is when I get in front of my students, we talk about like how many of you are involved in agriculture, and it is usually less than 3%. Just 100 years ago in PEI, that was the opposite. Over 95% of Islanders farmed. And so we'll look a little bit at that transition. And what this new book can tell us about that. Let me see if I get the... So my lab, where I have a number of students working on data entry and analysis, can you grab that second water there? Thank you. Looks at these big questions of land use change in Atlantic Canada, questions of resilience. In coastal areas, it's important because we're uniquely rural in the Maritimes, but we're also uniquely coastal, of course. And so agriculture, the reversion of farmland, the removal of hedgerows, things like that, the change from small fields to big fields, these are all questions that I look at and that I actually try to empirically test and analyze. But the book brings this all together and kind of tries to get at this question of how policy shaped land and society in Canada during one of the biggest transitions we've ever gone through. And the book uses air photos. It uses about 185 different air photos and maps to talk about that transition. And I do think that it's important to get at for topics of resilience. We've recently, of course, seen Fiona come through. In my own sense, I was the Canada Research Chair, but I spent a lot of time chainsawing. So when CBC called and asked me, I thought they might want to just ask me to talk about. I was out helping some neighbors and stuff, and it was a long story, but they eventually found me. I ended up, I didn't even know who I was talking to at first because I was in the dark. Quite literally, I was on my phone with a black screen, talking to a black screen, and there was Rosemary Barton, and that's me in my office. I just got it later, took a screenshot of it, because a bunch of us were out helping. It had nothing to do with the chainsawing research chair. It was just about local man without power. They didn't care about my research at all. I don't know why. But this looks like, this book, Time Flies, follows up on the other one that was just mentioned, Time and a Place, an environmental history of Prince Edward Island, where I wrote the first chapter about agriculture. John Paul Arsenault wrote another one about more recent agriculture. But what I found in my chapter of that is that what is known as Spud Isle, of course, at the moment, could have been called Cud Isle for most of its history. This was an area, this was a province that grew mostly grass, not so many row crops and not so many other crops at all. And so looking at the big transition away from fodder and grasses to crops is another aspect. But what happened with our animals as well? So it's another topic that I look at. But really some kind of broad changes that I see. I look at big transportation changes, so from railways and racetracks to roads and roundabouts. Time Flies is really a book about how Islanders get around, and in some cases keep going around and around. These are brand new infrastructures that we think of them as always there, but they're not. Most of these places, hopefully you'll see in some of my pictures here, are dramatically different just a few decades ago. It's also a book about land transitions. I mentioned animal to crop changes, which of course drives a number of changes. We have much healthier riparian zones now, and actually, as I'll show, I think we have more hedgerows. That was a surprise to me. But less local fertilizer production. I missed, unfortunately, the talk on manure management this morning, but I'm really interested in it, which of course has probably led to drops in soil organic matter. So we'll take a look at animals. And then just basic economic changes from an agrarian society where 95% of people farm to one where it's mostly service and tourism, and not too many people know that much about agriculture, even on PEI, the Garden of the Gulf, the food island, as it were. So, as in that new system, though, we've got new land use challenges. We have people moving, islanders are moving coastward like the fog, I say in the book. We have a dramatic shift from, looking back to the 1880s, I can look at the built housing environment. I'm not going to talk too much about this, but it was around 16% of our housing stock was within 250 meters of the coast. Now it's 28% of our housing stock. Islanders are moving and building along the coast. So this shift in an economic system from an agrarian to a service-based one is important. But mostly I just talk about how history looks different from the air. So it looks at about 50 different sites across PEI, and of course I can't go into all of them today. I'll touch on a few. But it's divided into these 4 chapters, and I'm going to really focus on chapters 1 and 2 right now because those are presumably what interests you most, in primary industries, especially farming, but also the rural infrastructure and those shift in things like road development. Won't get into too much urban and coastal, but it's there if you want to look at it. It was based originally on a project that I did and talked about here at the association a few years ago called the Back 50 Project, where we asked farmers to talk about their back 50 and to think back 50 years to the 1968 air photos. And these are a really rich set of photos that, when combined with things like historical maps and atlases, there they are all brought into a map viewer that people can see online. And this is publicly available if you go to my website, upei.ca/geolab. GEOLAB will bring you to a page where you can go and look at these maps. It's all free and open. But back 50 years, at that point, it was 50 years since 1968. And this was something that Islanders had never seen before. This was developed mostly for coastal measurements, but someone had the foresight to just do the whole island, so we were able to show it. And a lot of this book is based on that too. Compare it, of course, with modern ortho images, the more recent stuff, and we get a before and after time series of major changes. But of course, there's other ways to map the changes in PEI's land, and a big one is where people lived. I mentioned the kind of the drift to the coast. Well, that occurred in different ways at first, where we really saw a drift from an almost uniform, if you look at this map, almost completely uniform kind of densities across the province. There's a few kind of greenish yellow areas there that don't have as much density, but there's pretty well people in West Prince, East Kings, down east, all across the island. This takes the 14,000 farms and the houses all across PEI in 1935 and shows where the clusters are. It takes Charlottetown and Summerside out, so that doesn't kind of impact those, because those change a lot. And just looks at where rural Islanders live. And if you watch the change from 1935 to 1967, you do see a little shift. Now, there's not a lot of difference in the green dots, the location of houses, but you do see how Summerside and Charlottetown are starting to have a pull. West Prince still has a fairly significant community. And then when you, one of the reasons why was this anchor there? Why did Islanders kind of live across the island? And it's got to do with this. This is a census that I found that's a little bit unique because it tries to look at these unincorporated communities. And so in the Maritimes, just asking people, where do you live, right? And if you've driven through, Norborough or Springfield or Summerfield, where do you live? Which one of those? You might even say, well, I know Norborough's over there, but actually I'm in Springfield. I consider myself from Springfield. So the census enumerators said that across the country they would put an asterisk next to each community, that it was just too confusing to disassociate those. And they said when we got to PEI in Nova Scotia, there would be an asterisk next to every one of them. They're just very confusing. So in PEI, there's 400 of these communities, and what they are is our villages. This was a village-based agrarian society where the village had pretty much everything you needed. Now, by 1971, there aren't too many blacksmiths around, but of course, a lot of mechanics, a lot of local businesses. But around that time, what happens in PEI history? We get a lot of new and really great, well-paved roads. And islanders who originally had banned the automobile and were really reluctant to kind of transition to automobility got cars, and we loved our cars. And pretty soon those villages no longer became useful. People would be working in town, right? And they would go to town to buy things. And so these villages disappear. And we go from this 1967 view to 2011. Again, the two urban areas removed. There's really no kind of concentration that can rival the suburbs that have surrounded Charlottetown. So Ed McDonald in his book talks about this as kind of gravitational pull toward the city. And indeed, we have a tenfold increase from about 600 homes to 6,000 homes around the Charlottetown area. The suburbs are growing up. Okay, so I'll skip ahead here and get to what you all really want to talk about is the context here, agriculture. And, you know, hopefully those storm clouds aren't too ominous. It's still a very strong and good industry, but it is seeing some major changes. And so if you've heard about some of the kind of news from the 2021 census, I'm a bit of a census nerd, like news when the census comes out. This was where we saw that the dark brown areas across Atlantic Canada, which are mostly PEI, that's where over 60% of local land, total land, is used for agriculture. There's a few of them, and they're mostly East Prince, right, and a little southeast Queens, a little bit in central Queens, but those highest densely agricultural areas shifted. Now, you got to watch the screen carefully from 2016 to 2021 because Census Canada decided to use this year, unfortunately, to change the boundaries, right? So it now doesn't go in those rectilinear boundaries, but we do see that there is a significant drop. And let's try this pointer here. Yeah, so, you know, especially southeast Queens, there's no area there where 60% or more is in farmland. So we do know that farmland is declining, but how much? So this is the total number of farms, and this is all Atlantic Canada. And this is really dramatic, right? Because you see in 1921, everyone, get this to work, pushing the wrong button. There we go. 1921, Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, everyone's a farmer, right? Doesn't matter if you're actually a fisherman. You call yourself a farmer when the census comes around. And everyone was farming. There really wasn't much else to do. Everybody, whether you had 2 cattle or what, you considered yourself a farmer. So the practice and the kind of profession of farming had changed. So in Prince Edward Island, we have 14,000 farms at the beginning of the century. That declines to about 6,000 or 7,000 by mid-century, and today we've now dropped just below 1,200. Of course, that's the stat in 1921, just below 1,200. But the size of farms, of course, is going up over this time. So from 21 until today, we see the average size go up. And it really, despite the kind of different legislative traditions in the provinces, they're really kind of following a similar trajectory, especially in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia, PEI. So the size of farms is going up, number of farms is going down. And then if you just focus on the last 50 years, let's see if this works. Yes, good. I was worried about the transition to Mac, if it would do it, but this is the last few. We do see the kind of steady decline across all 4 provinces. All right, so let's dial in and look at PEI. Here's our townships, or lots as they're known, the 67 lots in the 3 counties. What happens over this long run of PEI's history? So the next slide shows our total agricultural land, and that's sort of cultivated arable land, so crops and pasture together. And there they are in the 3 different counties. Black is Queens, blue is Prince, and purple is Kings. So Kings was always the sort of smallest and last to be farmed. So it also was the first to drop off in the process I mentioned earlier called reversion. The black line over top of that is on a different axis. That's the number of people in PEI. And you can see that in the early 20th century, sorry, I should have some lines on here, but the early 20th century, going up and down here, this is when we really see a decline in the number of people in PEI. This is when farmers and other rural islanders were going down the road, right? Going to Toronto, going to the Boston States, moving off the island. That's when Old Home Week became a big deal because people were coming back to celebrate with family in August. But then the rise continues throughout the 20th century, fairly steady until, of course, this dramatic last 5 years that we've all been talking about quite a lot. A lot more people in PEI, growth that doubles or triples the annual growth for the last couple decades before that. But at the same time, we see this rather dramatic decline here. You see that? Yeah, this rather dramatic decline in the last 20 years of total farmland. So what does that mean for PEI agriculture? And what did that look like kind of from the air? So the next 4 slides show where PEI farmland was in 1935, 58, 2000, 2020. As I said to someone here, I just made the 2020 map last night with the brand new corporate land use inventory. And, but this is the green, of course, is the forest, which means basically everything else was agriculture in the beginning. Now it's not so much the case. Of course, if it's open space, it could be all kinds of other development. But watch the change here. The big shift from 1935 to 1950 is this shift you're going to see here. So as farmland is being abandoned in all 3 counties in the 1930s and 40s and 50s, this is what it looks like on the land, right? So from 35 backwards to 58 forwards, lots of new forest is growing up on old abandoned farmland. And this was predominantly in kind of marginal areas, places that didn't make the best farmland. And places, you see places like the Culloden Hills down here. If we go back and forth, you see East Kings up here. I'll go back one more time to 35. You'll see a lot of those fill in dramatically. A lot of that farmland, if you walk through forests there today, it was farmland at one point, including the farm that I grew up in Hazel Grove. I was running through those forests thinking, this is primordial landscape. I'm going to find kind of all kinds of cool things in the forest here, and it turns out it was a farm field like 40 years earlier. So there it is in 2000. So again, 1958, 2000, we see even more growth. What's happened since then is what people are talking about, that as a probable increase in deforestation, or a definite increase in deforestation. But as we've seen, it's not for farmland, not necessarily. In some places, farmland is increasing, but in many other places, it's declining. So from 2000 to 2020. So 2000 to 2020, the difference is only 20 years, a little bit less than the others. And that makes it a little harder to see kind of patterns, but there are places that in the farm belts where little deforestation is going up, and there are places where forest is growing up. The net difference appears to be a decline in the forest for the first time in about 80 years. Okay, moving along. So did PEI go from a place that was known for ruminants to row crops? In fact, it did. But the sort of, as you know, the peak of row cropping was really in the 80s and 90s, and the book looks a little bit at that. There it is compared to the Canadian potato acreage, the red line, of course, being PEI, peaked in the 80s and 90s and declined in the early 2000s. Okay, so this is like, let's look at this in a different way. Where were those animals, the ruminants, the cut aisle? Here is a stacked line showing all of the livestock types on PEI for all of its kind of British settlement history. And it followed the exact same trajectory as the land and the population for the most part, except it really levels out in the early 20th century. That total amount of animals right there, total amount of animals is kind of leveling out. And then it declines a little bit, but watch this. This is how I break PEI history into 3 different kind of periods. The first one is settlement, and that's known by the process of extensification. We can talk about it more later, but it's where when you need to make more food, you extend or plow new land, right? So it was an era, it was a time when you could find lots of new land in PEI. Then when no new land is available and you see a decline in some of the marginal land, you still have produce going up. Output is still increasing, but it's occurring with the same number of animals and actually less farmland, because remember, land's dropping quite a bit there. And then we have the introduction of fossil fuels and intensification. If you look at that last 20 years, that is the drop in total animal biomass on PEI. So we have a 40% drop since the 2000 mad cow disease and the decline of the packer plants. So what this means is one of my research tries to do is look at how we fed animals differently between then and now, what that meant for kind of the balance of energy flows on landscape. This is an early map that looked at where the livestock were in the 1860s and where the shortages were in feed. And I won't get into that except to say that islanders kind of, here they are, the possible fodders of Confederation on the wagon, making some hay. and they were doing so in a way that kind of falls under that organic intensification. So without fossil fuels and without even mechanization in many ways, they were applying new things and new innovations to the land. And one of them that's best known in PEI is mussel mud. So here's the report from a guy in Ottawa who's like, what the heck? I'm getting all these samples of mud from Nova Scotia and PEI, 17 mud samples from PEI. People were sending him in the mud saying, how can I put this on my land and get better fertilizer? And what were they doing? Well, this kind of relatively unique PEI experience of digging mussel mud to spread on the fields. It's usually shown as this kind of romantic process of a couple of people going down and digging it up themselves, but it actually was a pretty industrial kind of commercial process. You'd have hundreds of men, mostly out, gathering and digging up mussel mud and buying it from diggers down there. The earliest census, back when PEI wasn't part of Canada, 1871, shows where that mud was because we cared so much about it. We actually recorded where farmers were using mud, and you can definitely see that it's in the West River and the Bedeque River especially. After this, I just took St. Peter's off of this, unfortunately, but I was just saying to Frank down there that St. Peter's became a dedicated mud digging place where the provincial government, built a special railway spur out onto the bay and dug the mussel mud from there for years. All right, so let me wrap up with just one example here. Okay, I'm told I get an extra 5. But I do want to kind of, you know about mechanization. We go from this number of people to this number of people producing the same or more food. And that was part of that organic intensification and early mechanization. And eventually, of course, you need fossil fuels to run those machines. But another thing you see is that you need fewer people. So over time, of course, the number of farmers is declining because there's now, you can do much more work with fewer people, and maybe 2 people on this equipment here, but maybe just 1.5, because that fellow looks like he's about 10 years old driving the tractor. And then some people, of course, did a little bit of both. Here's both horse and tractor crowded around a farm in Cornwall, and people working together. There were other transitions underway. Islanders were working on kind of different types of agriculture, and fox farming is one of the big and more famous ones. If you look at in the sites in the book, there's a number of spots where I look at the fox farming industry from the air. But this is my favorite, probably Northam, where the Milligan and Morrison brothers had a massive Holstein barn, the biggest in Atlantic Canada. And they were the first to build a racetrack, and they made most of their money on foxes. Now, in Northam, you can see it from the 1935 air photos. Nothing there today except for a few empty fields, but there's the fox pens that they built under point C, and then there's more in the woods under point B, and of course their big racetrack, which in 1933 became the first lit racetrack at night. Unfortunately, they only had enough power to run 1/4 of the track at a time under lights, so they had a relay set up that would follow the horses around, lighting up 1/4 of the track as the horses ran. So I thought that was great. But in 1968, they actually died tragically in a car accident in Detroit. And the farm was left or bought and eventually became not a fox farm because the whole industry had collapsed by then. But here you can see in 1968 from the air, the pens are still there. But watch this, from today's photo, 2020, you can still see the imprint of those fox pens in the field. So if any of you are farming that field out in Northam, you won't be able to see it from the cab of the tractor, but if you just go a little bit higher, those fox pens, the imprint of them are still there. And the racetrack is too, yeah, you can see the oval. There's lots of those on the island fields, ovals left over. Okay. This one, just a great shot, kind of a oblique air photo in Emerald Junction. And there's the tracks when they originally went to Cape Traverse, but then eventually junctioned off to Borden. You can see the station here the station here, which is still there today, and a couple of these buildings are still there. And the air photo kind of does some comparisons of an oblique angle like that to a top-down angle. And in this one, you can really see the difference between a grass-based agriculture, grass and crops, or grass and grains, to a potato-based agriculture, including some of our, well, not say first pivot rotations, but we are getting some increasing numbers of irrigation, which is another thing that I'm interested in studying. And I think the most important, I told Alex I'd talk about the most important change, is that cropland really levels out in the Atlantic provinces, doesn't really drop much. I think someone was just talking about this in a presentation, but cropland is more or less even. But what we do see dropping, of course, is pasture. And if that, in the last 70 years, we can get a good number of the pasture land, and if you look at that, that is the decline, about 85% decline in the pasture land. So as new land is being kind of converted, or as land's being converted from pasture and grassland to cropland, the amount of cropland can stay the same, and even the total amount, it appears, of agricultural land is declining somewhat, but it's not necessarily requiring a lot of new deforestation, although I think that is a concern. So I think that's where I'll leave it. I wanted to get maybe to the, skip ahead here, guys, to the comprehensive development plan and how some of the post-war history shaped that. But if you wanted to ask about that in the Q&A, I can talk about how some of those post-war policies might have driven this. And I did mention hedgerows and how I was really interested in whether those were being torn up, as a lot of the literature, a lot of people, actually critics were saying, you know, this policy is meaning that everyone's going and tearing up all their hedgerows. Well, I did a study with the students in the lab with 14 case study lots, and we showed that it didn't actually happen that way. Small fields were converted to big fields, but the hedgerows themselves, watch this, increased dramatically by about 43% in all of my case study areas between the 1960s and today. Now that we've added the last 10 years, though, there does seem to be a small decrease, so hedgerows might be actually being removed more now than they ever were in the past. And I will leave it at that. Thank you very much. You can skip back to the header slide or whatever.
Oh, time flies indeed. Thank you, Josh. I look forward to reading your book. Here you are. Just like to quickly introduce our next speaker, John Turvey from O'Maffra, Ontario. Please join me in welcoming John Turvey.
So as we wait for the slides to come up, I will preface this by saying I am not going to try to pull off nearly as many dad jokes as Josh did. I'm just not that good a public speaker at that. So I'm going to pass on that. But anyway, thank you very much for inviting me to join you here. I was asked to sort of talk a bit about what we do in Ontario in terms of how we approach land use planning and agriculture. So hopefully you won't find this too dry. I tried to make sure I wasn't, I knew full well I wasn't speaking to a room full of land use planners, so hopefully I've got this aimed at a level that'll work, but if I do get too technical, just like, you know, throw up the I'm done sign and we'll try to raise it up a notch. Okay, so there's lots of statistics on this slide. They really don't matter. I mean, if you want to know a little bit about Ontario agriculture, go ahead and read them. The important point to take from this slide is the area and the various colors. So the yellow, the bright green, which you can see is kind of is our class 1 land. Yellow is class 2, orange is class 3. There's a bit of brown on there, class 4, and then the purpley color is sort of 5, 6, and 7 combined. The whole point of this slide is to tell you that the best agricultural land in Ontario is in the east, in the here around the Ottawa Valley, in the lower St. Lawrence, and of course here down here in the peninsula between the Great Lakes. And that's where the best land is, and surprise, surprise, that's where most of Ontarians work, live, and play. And because of that, that's why we have to have rules about agriculture and land use planning, because otherwise we wouldn't necessarily have any farmland at all if we just let the system do its own thing. So that's the reason. It'd be great if we had lots of land up in the north, because look, there's all kinds of room up there, but unfortunately there isn't any, well, I should say none, but there's not a lot of farmland up in northern Ontario. So that's the whole reason we have to have land use planning. And the main way we do it in Ontario is something under our Planning Act called the Provincial Policy Statement. So the Planning Act is a piece of legislation that applies across the entire province, and it's the main tool we use to identify and protect farmland. Section 3 of our Planning Act requires that municipality, the province, or something called the Ontario Land Tribunal, I will not get into that because that's getting way too technical. Whenever they're making a decision under the Planning Act, they shall be consistent with the provincial policy statement. Again, what does shall be consistent with mean? I'm going to preface this by saying I'm not a planning lawyer, and planning lawyers can lecture on that for an entire semester at the University of Guelph in the School of Planning. But generally speaking, it means you have to follow the rules. So the provincial policy statement applies province-wide, and it focuses on all the different things that the province deems to be of interest. So it includes things like healthy communities, natural heritage like woodlots and wetlands, water resources, as well as agriculture. And the policies are future-oriented and outcome-based, meaning they don't tell you necessarily how to do things, but they're telling you what you are to achieve. In that sense, they're more goal-oriented. And I will preface this by also saying that, you could ask me in 2 weeks, and it may be that this entire presentation has been revised because we are in the midst of doing a provincial rule of the provincial policy statement, but I'll take my chances that most of what I'm going to say is still going to apply, several weeks from now, but we'll have to wait and see. The other important thing we have is provincial land use plans. And so we have, I've flagged 4 of these. There's actually a lot more than that, but these are the 4 sort of important ones. And all 4 of them happen to be within the area that Ontarians like to call the Greater Golden Horseshoe. So that area that's sort of around the City of Toronto and the City of Hamilton at the west end of Lake Ontario. We have 3 of them that are sort of tell us where not to grow. So we have the Greenbelt Plan, the Niagara Escarpment Plan, and the Oak Ridges Marine Conservation Plan. And we have one that tells us where to grow and how to grow, and that is the usually by planners just referred to as the growth plan, but it has this complex place to growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe. Mostly it builds off the provincial policy statement, and the other key little thing I'll note is municipalities, when they're making land use decisions, must conform with provincial plans, and those of you looking for bonus land use planning points just realized I said conform and not consistent with. And trust me, that is what that planning class will teach you and how long that will take to learn the difference. But suffice to say, again, really it just means follow the rules. So our key policy is one that requires municipalities to identify primary cultural areas and ensure that they are protected and made available for long-term use for agriculture. And I'm going to talk a little bit, focus on how we actually map and identify those areas. We use an agricultural systems approach in the Greater Golden Horseshoe. Municipalities are required to use that approach. Elsewhere, the agricultural system approach is encouraged. Municipalities will identify and map lands based on provincial policies and our definitions. And then there's a number of policies that go with that. And so you'll see, we'll talk a little bit about, we have policies that relate to types, sizes, and intensities of ag uses and normal farm practices, so making sure you can more or less do whatever you want to do if it's an ag use, as well as opportunities for agriculture-related and on-farm diversified uses. Lot creation opportunities are limited, and that we have a process that does allow for lands to be removed from a primary cultural area for a settlement area expansion, for gravel pits, or for other non-residential uses, think golf courses or churches and schools, for example. But again, it's a process that limits how much of that can happen. So when we're identifying primary cultural areas, we focus on identifying them in large blocks, usually looking at areas of 250 hectares, give or take, where the soils are primarily going to be class 1 to 3 soils. We can include small pockets of class 4 to 7, especially when they're being used as part of an agricultural operation. When I talk with planning students about this, I talk a bit about this is kind of like Swiss cheese. There is no primary cultural area that I've ever seen that has not got holes in it. And so the whole point is this is really about Swiss cheese. And Swiss cheese has holes in it. That's what makes it Swiss cheese, actually. If you start shoving jalapeno or pimento into the holes, you no longer have Swiss cheese, you have, Monterey Jack with habanero in it or whatever, right? But by its nature, our prime agricultural areas in Ontario are always going to have a bit of a Swiss cheese effect. In some parts of Ontario, it's pretty easy. You can just do this by pulling out the soils map and it's good to go. I would never tell a land use planner working in Essex County down in the southwest that they need to actually do anything more than pull out a soils map. It's pretty clear what's good ag land. But in other parts of Ontario, we use something called a land evaluation area review, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a couple of slides. And we always encourage municipalities to use identifiable boundaries. So use roads, use lot lines, use things that people can easily, readily identify. Don't say, well, the soils polygon goes across there on the map, so that's where it's going to go. No, but snap it to something that's very clear like this, taped on the floor. Everybody can see that and would know where that line is. I will talk very briefly about specialty crop areas. We also have a policy that says we have specialty crop areas. They would be predominantly areas where you're growing tender fruit, grapes, other fruit crops, vegetable crops. Would consider things like the soil, climate factors, and importantly as well, this notion of even having farmers who are skilled in those types of production, and also looking at the types of investment you might have made in capital or crops and drainage. The two that probably everybody knows outside of Ontario is, of course, the Niagara Peninsula and the Holland Marsh, but there's a number of other these across the province. The key difference for these, and again, they're a very small proportion of our area, but urban boundary expansions are prohibited into specialty crop areas. So this is the one place where you can't go in terms of an urban boundary expansion. So I mentioned this agricultural system. So what is this agricultural system approach? So the idea here is that is to take a holistic approach to looking at this. We used to just focus on looking at the soil capability and focusing primarily on the land, and heard lots of criticism over that over time about, well, that's great, like we now know where the good land is, but if we haven't actually factored in some of the other factors that go into whether or not it's a thriving agricultural area, what good is the point of protecting the land? So the idea behind agricultural systems approach is to bring together two sides of this, to focus not only on just the actual, make sure I get the right button here, the land-based piece, but to also look at the agri-food network. And by that, we're looking at the infrastructure, we're looking at the agri-food assets, so your processors, your inputs, also the outputs, where's that going? And looking at the things that support that broader agri-food sector. And I kind of touched on this, but why take this approach? So part of the logic to doing this is that the agri-food sector is the biggest and one of the biggest and most resilient sectors of the Ontario economy, and it has good growth potential. It's the foundation of our thriving rural communities. It promotes food culture and good health. And the critical needs for the full agri-food sector isn't just good land. That's an important part of it. Farmers do need certainty about knowing there's going to be a land base available to make business decisions. But you need a welcoming business environment, you need supportive rural communities, and you need that infrastructure to go along with it. And then lastly, of course, you need healthy soil, water, and air. So why we take a systems approach is to make sure we're considering all of those factors. And so this is just a quick example of how that might look on the landscape. So in this case, the areas in the dark brown color would be good agricultural land. The areas in yellow are some areas we've identified as being not as good agricultural land. This bright purpley magenta color is a specialty crop area. This mauve color is a couple various settlement areas. And again, you'll see here we've identified various parts of the system. In this case, a seed supplier, growers, transportation network, the processor located here, and the animal feed supplier located here. So this idea of thinking about this not just in terms of where's the land, but where's the entire network and how does it connect together. Lear. So for most of as I said, most municipalities in the Southwest probably wouldn't use this approach because it would sort of be overkill for what they're trying to do. But we do use a LEAR methodology and recommend that, and there's a number of reasons for doing it. It's a way to identify high-quality agricultural areas in a way that is both consistent and transparent, and that decision makers and the public can understand. I mean, I can sit there as a land use planner with my professional opinion and draw a map and say, based on all the data, here's what I think is the good ag land. Another land use planner can do that, and the maps will be a lot alike, but they'll have differences, I guarantee it. Nobody does this the same two ways, and some people are glass half full people, and some are glass half empty people, and that means those maps are always different. The benefit of using a LEAR methodology is that you're doing it in a way that you're documenting what you're doing it and how you're doing it, and therefore people can understand how you've approached this. It works very effectively in areas where the soil mapping can be very complex or very heterogeneous. So you're getting into a real mix of class 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 getting mixed together. This works very well in those types of environments. You can account for multiple factors. So you can not just look at soil capability, but think about a range of other things you want to consider, including considering whether something is a natural heritage feature on adjoining lands. It allows for local input. So you can actually create a process whereby you can get input from the local community into this as you're working on it, and it provides you then a basis for making long-term land use planning decisions. And yeah, as the most important part, it can be replicated. So you can take this model and take it from one community to another, and in that sense, it can be compared between jurisdictions as well. So when you're doing a LEAR, there are two main parts that go into this. There's the LE part, or the land evaluation part. That's the part where you're going to look at the land in terms of and the resources in terms of their inherent agricultural capability. So that's looking at things like the Canada Land Inventory soils mapping and what it says about the actual soils, looking at the climatic conditions. Those would be examples of LE factors. The area review side is looking at those factors that would affect viability that are not those inherent qualities of the soil. They'd be looking at things like existing land uses on adjoining lands. How fragmented is that? And by that I mean how many lots have you cut the land up into? And those other things that would affect suitability for long-term agricultural use. You then combine those things together to get an overall LEAR score for each evaluation unit that you're looking at. And then when you've got an area where evaluation units are getting high scores in a big cluster or group, that's where your areas of high agricultural potential are located. So in Ontario, for our approach, we used an evaluation unit of 100 meters by 100 meters, roughly 1 hectare, and put those in a grid. That might be a little hard to see on that slide. Oops, I keep wanting to point up. But you can see there's one little grid there, 1 hectare. And in the LEAR, some things we do, we score based on what's the characteristics within an evaluation unit. Other things we're scoring based on the characteristics of what's around the evaluation unit. And to do that, we use a distance of 750 meters to buffer around each evaluation unit. That happens to be about 256 hectares. And if you were catching my math at the start, when I said we usually try to identify areas of 250 hectares, you'll notice there's a bit of a relationship there in terms of what we're trying to do. So we did a LEAR for the Greater Golden Horseshoe area in Ontario. We had 3 factors in it. There's an LE factor based on CLI mapping. It's worth 60 points. And so the way you can read that is if you have a hectare of land that's all class 1 soil, it's going to get a total of 60 points. If you have a hectare of land that's all class 7, it's going to get a score of 0. And everything will fall somewhere in between that. We then used 2 AR factors. The first was whether or not there's actually the amount of agricultural production in the area around that evaluation unit, and was looking at AAFC's annual crop inventory mapping for that purpose. That was worth 30 points. And then fragmentation, which was based on the number of parcels located within that evaluation area. So if we went to that and looked around how many parcels were there. For context, if you're looking at 250 hectares around you in Ontario, much of Ontario was surveyed out as either 100-acre lots or 200-acre lots, and in the years after, by Confederation, most of that's been cut up to hundreds and fifties. So it's not uncommon for that number to be at least 4 or 5 when you start thinking about 40 hectares as being a 100-acre lot. But anyway, that was the evaluation factor for that we took into consideration. A couple things we don't consider. So we don't consider whether or not there's an urban boundary beside you in a settlement area. So we don't count it against you if there happens to be 200 houses across the property line because there's an urban boundary there. We also don't look at natural heritage features. So there's a basis for, although they're not exactly immediately excluded, there's kind of a way to account for that as well. And the other important thing I would think about with approaching this from an agricultural systems point of view was, and this is a little hard to see, but it wouldn't be uncommon in Ontario to have found this where you have two municipalities that, this is the boundary between two municipalities. They've mapped things differently. One of them decides to, recognize a natural heritage feature. Something goofy happens along the road, and one of them has an ag boundary going one way versus another. The benefit of going with this sort of broader agricultural systems approach was that we made things more consistent, especially at municipal boundaries, by giving them common nomenclature and a common way of mapping things, and really focusing on getting folks to recognize doing things as overlays. So yes, there might be a water course in here that's important, but recognizing that that functions as both an agricultural area and a natural heritage area. And by doing it as an overlay, you're recognizing both things as being important. The other important part of this, of course, is, as I mentioned, that economic development component, that piece about the agri-food network. So immediately this gets out of the part that I work on a whole lot, but we do have a number of things that we do in our ministry to sort of promote that broader aspect of what municipalities can do to support the system in terms of things they can do in terms of engaging with ag economic development opportunities and what things they can do to support that in a broader community. And I did talk briefly at the very beginning about a few other things that we do. So I thought I would touch on a few of these other land use policies that we have. I'm not going to go into great detail about this because this could really drag on if I did. But the permitted uses piece is an important part of what we do. So we really have 3 types of permitted uses we allow on agricultural land in Ontario. First one's easy. We just say agricultural uses are permitted. Now that sounds easy, but then we get into discussions that have unfolded over things like, is growing cannabis an agricultural use? And of course, I think we've dealt with that one, but we've had those sort of questions over time. But the other 2 things we have are agriculture-related uses and on-farm diversified uses, and we have guidance material that helps municipalities with those questions. I'm not going to go through a lot of this in great detail, but simply to say this kind of is the breakout about what the difference between those things are. But essentially, agriculture-related uses, think of things like feed mills, think of grain elevators, think of cold storage facilities. Those are all examples of things that would fit in agriculture-related use. They support the broader community. They're supporting farms in the area. On-farm diversified uses can be almost anything you can think of. It could be a hairdressing salon. It could be a lawyer's office. It could be whatever you can think somebody might do, but what we do is we limit that use in terms of the amount of land it's allowed to occupy. And it's 2% of a parcel of land up to 1 hectare. I will talk very quickly. We have another tool that, this is one that really gets, I get kind of excited about this one, is agricultural impact assessments. This is one we are working on. Our document is still a draft, but we are hoping we'll be able to finalize it once the new policies get landed here in the next few months. And what this is looking at if you're doing something in terms of allowing development on ag lands, looking at the impacts to neighboring agricultural operations with an eye to looking at opportunities to either avoid those impacts or minimize and mitigate them. So that's a really important tool that we're working on and developing. And then lastly, I will just touch on, we do have an MDS in Ontario, and that's also seen as quite often being an important tool in terms of settling land use conflicts. I understand you have something very similar here, so I won't spend a lot of time on that, but I will leave it at that. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Sean. That was really interesting to hear about how Ontario takes their approach to land use protection. Our next speaker is going to be joining us virtually from Windsor, Nova Scotia. It's Crystal Fuller. She will be telling us about how they approach agricultural land protection in Nova Scotia. So please join me in welcoming Crystal Fuller. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Can everyone hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes, Crystal. Yep, you're good.
Okay. Just let me get my screens organized if you don't mind. And so that you don't have to hear any, apparently there was a conversation about bad dad jokes, but I don't know if there's equivalent to bad mum jokes. So, sorry. So can you see my screen at all? Can you see that?
Yeah, looks good now, Crystal. Are we okay back there? Yep. Yep, you're good now, Crystal.
Okay, that's great. So sorry to make you sit through a virtual presentation so late in the afternoon, and I will be really brief because I know it's hard to talk to in disembodied voice. But I'm going to just talk a little bit about the agricultural land use policies, and I feel like I should have gone after John because Ontario has really progressed and has a lot of the stuff that I'm going to sort of criticize about the agricultural land use policies. But I'm also going to, I'm a planner and I've worked in both the public sector, working for municipalities, and now I'm a private consultant, which gives me a little bit of ability to maybe speak more freely. I just want to point out that this is a picture of my dad and his two brothers from probably the 20s or 30s. Looks like they were probably doing some pruning and taking down some apple trees. I grew up on an apple farm in the Annapolis Valley. My dad's I know it's blurry, but my dad's the guy with the hat on and on back of the team of oxen. So I often see my professional work through my family's personal journey with agriculture. So this is a picture actually from the family farm. In Nova Scotia, in my area of Nova Scotia, the Acadians built an extensive dike system, super valuable agricultural land, very rich. The scientists in the room can explain to you exactly why, but the tides come in, dump their mud, then it was reclaimed by the Acadians, and that soil is very productive. So there was significant agricultural land, and I'm just talking about agricultural activity sort of from the European perspective. And that was all pre-1765. My family came up after the Acadians were expelled from the area, and we had original land grants after 1765, and we kind of did our thing until the World War II. World War II and the industrialization of farming changed farming. My cousin still farms this piece of land today, and you know, it's a different world than the last sort of 200 or 300 years of farming that's gone on. So it was easy to maintain agricultural activity when there were a few pressures on your land, and that the community was generally supportive of it. And I think the previous speaker, particularly the first gentleman from with his really interesting book, you know, spoke to that. So in Nova Scotia, agriculture is an important activity. The province has indicated that there are provincial interests in play. So from a land use planning perspective, these are sort of the hierarchies. And this is taken from an article that I'm going to reference in a minute. And it's probably hard to read, but there's a few things on here I want to highlight. At the provincial level, there's been some studies that really focused on agricultural land preservation. You can see most of them are 15 going on 20 years old. I was involved in several of these back in the day. There hasn't been much done recently. In terms of legislation, there's something called a Municipal Government Act, that Municipal Government Act empowers the municipalities to do whatever they're going to do. The planning regulations are within that. Within the Municipal Government Act, there's something called the Provincial Statement of Interest. There's 6 of them in Nova Scotia. And one of them is regarding agricultural land. So all the municipal planning strategies, or as they're known in PEI, official plans, which are the documents that guide land use, and the municipalities have to be generally consistent with these provincial statements of interest. Nova Scotia also has a fairly strict Marshland Conservation Act to guide these dike systems that are around the province, which are really being, there's some pressure on some of them, and there are ways to seek variances so that you can develop on some of these marshland acts. But the Marshland Conservation Act is intended to maintain these marshlands, which is a good thing because they are important for no other reason than they help protect our coasts. And with climate change, you know, the province increasingly recognizes the value that the dike system provides. And then there's a Farm Practices Act, which, you know, some would call the right to farm legislation. If you talk to farmers, they would say it's not really worth a whole lot and doesn't protect them a whole lot. But that is also an important piece of legislation. The governance for the municipal planning strategies and our planning documents comes from the Provincial Director of Planning, which oversees the planning documents of all the municipalities, and then you can appeal things to the Utility and Review Board. But really where the heavy lifting is done is at the local level, where local communities and municipalities adopt land use plans. So I'm going to just talk about that in a second. But firstly, before we talk about what the local municipalities are doing, just like to talk a little bit about the statement of provincial interest that is supposed to guide all the municipalities as they develop their land use plans. So essentially, municipalities are the enforcers and the developers of the policies and the regulations regarding land and agricultural land. These are not regulatory requirements. You see the statement on the left-right side of the screen, but they're just guidance documents that the planning policies are supposed to be generally consistent with. However, if there were no planning regulations in place in that particular municipality, then there was no requirement for the municipalities to be compliant with this statement of provincial interest. So if there's no zoning, then there was nothing stopping anything to happen in the communities. Now, recently, the province, the last 3 or 4 years, passed minimum planning regulations. And so most of the municipalities are getting regulations in place, zoning regulations, but still there are places in Nova Scotia that are unzoned, which basically means you can just come in and get a building permit and do what you want. So if you want to build a house, you can just do that even if it's in the middle of a field that's important. And if the plan doesn't identify agricultural land, then it's not protected. And how you identify agricultural land, I think John did a really good job. That's can be very discretionary. So the other point I just want to mention is that maybe just hold on to this notion that municipalities are the enforcers of the agricultural policy, because that's a very difficult thing in small rural communities particularly. So this is the article I was referring to earlier. I think this map is it's from 2015, but the article was published in the Journal of Agriculture, Food Systems and Community Development in 2021. And I know it's probably hard for you to read, but I think this is a good snapshot in Nova Scotia. So the green colors are the CLI categories. So class 2, class 3, class 4 is what's mapped here. We have no class 1 in Nova Scotia. As far as I know, there's none sort of east of Quebec, and I don't know if there's any east of Ontario, but John would probably know more than I. But there's none certainly in Nova Scotia. I understand that's because our growing season isn't quite long enough. But you can see that there's very little class 2, which is the darker green. The class 3 is sort of the brighter green, and the class 4 is sort of the lighter, almost neon-y color. The striped lines are where there's some kind of zoning regarding agricultural land. So where you see the green and no striped lines, at least in 2015, that's where there were no land use regulations regarding agriculture. Since this map was developed, Annapolis and Cumberland have both brought in land use regulations, but I would call them land use light. They're still fairly light regulations. So let's just look at a couple of these specific communities and municipalities. So this is the county of Annapolis. So some of you might know where Annapolis Royal is, or the community college in Lawrencetown, which has all the planning students you graduate from. This is the Bay of Fundy. So if you go over you go north, you go to New Brunswick. And this is the major 100 series road. That's the main highway going along the valley floor, basically from Halifax down to Yarmouth. So on this map, this kind of mustard color are the agriculturally zoned lands. As has been previously discussed, it's funny how all the agriculturally zoned lands seem to be in the places where people want to live. So if this is the major highway system, these are the towns that where people live, and this is the flat part, because this is what we call the North Mountain, and this is the South Mountain, and this is the valley. This is where the agricultural zoning is and where there's the most pressure for development. So if we just take a closer look at that, you can see that the agricultural zoning is a small part of this county and is along those communities where there's infrastructure like water and sewer and community centers, where there are actual communities. As far as I can tell, based on their recently adopted plan, this zoning was simply based on existing agricultural activity, not based on soil capability, not based on anything more than just where they are farming now and what makes sense to put that around. So next door, so if you just come back towards Halifax, so to the east, this is the County of Kings, which has the most robust agricultural protection in Nova Scotia. It goes back to 1979. And this is their future land use map. And all this yellow is what's designated as an agricultural area. This map shows their agricultural zoning. So the dark brown is A2. The lighter color, I don't know if you can see my mouse, is the A1, which is the highest level of regulation. And it's a pretty robust regulatory regime they have to protect the A1 lands. Again, you can see the valley floor is pretty much, so the 101, the major highway, kind of runs, this way through it. So this is the area of most pressure as well. So what's interesting, and I just sort of snapped these two together just in a rough way to sort of see. And this goes to what John just said, where how municipalities categorize and zone, and the methodology for it and the approach for it, particularly on the edge, doesn't always jive very well. So this is the Annapolis County map. This is the Kings County map. And you can see how it just stops. So there's a higher level of regulation here. You get to the county line, and then it sort of falls off. So there's not a great deal of, there's probably very little consistency between these two adjacent municipal units. And until 6 months ago, this Annapolis County map, you wouldn't have seen any zoning on most of it. So this is, I told you about Kings County. This is how they have chosen to designate their agricultural lands. They zone the class 2 and class 3 lands. Anything that's more than 60% class 2 and class 3 is protected, and active class 4. So they have determined that they're going to base this not on existing use just, but also the capacity of the soils to produce agriculture. So their approach is quite different than what Annapolis County did. The other place on the map that I showed you, which the original map of 4 or 5 slides before, which was about the class CLI in Nova Scotia, where the 2, 3, and 4 lands were. This is in Cumberland, so how can I help you find your way here? So this is Amherst. This surrounds Amherst, so this is this when you come into Nova Scotia, you just come across the border and you're in Cumberland. So this is their future land map. So the gray is all their resource zones. So it's most of the county, and then there's some pockets of growth in here. But then so just remember that gray, and then if you look at their zoning map, this sort of yellow color is of that resource designation, how much of it is agriculture. Cumberland has not seen a lot of development over the last 20 years, but then like everywhere else in Canada pretty much, there's now a lot of pressure that they are seeing. What's interesting about this land use regulatory regime is that it's fairly simple, at least according to the policies and we actually work for Cumberland County, so help assisting with their planning regulations. It's fairly simple to rezone out of agriculture. So in Kings County, it's actually very difficult. You have to do a lot, and you can't just simply rezone A1 land to A2. It's very, very difficult. Here, it's not the same. And they have used the CLI somewhat to determine these boundaries, but it's not as rigorous as perhaps what Kings County has done. So you can see that, probably the 3 most agriculturally based areas, maybe East Hants, which is just sort of on the way from Halifax to Truro, it's sort of in that area. That also has a lot of agricultural land too, but their mapping wasn't as easy to explain. Those 4 municipalities are probably the 4 most important agricultural areas in Nova Scotia. Another interesting part of the Nova Scotia situation, I talked earlier about the Marshland Act. There are significant areas of marshland, and they have been historically areas where farmers really like to be active because they're so valuable in terms of the soil capability. You can grow a lot on there. They're very, very productive. These areas, again, are often in areas that are very scenic and beautiful and are part of our tourist brand. And particularly, you're probably aware of the landscape of Grand Pré. So the dike system outside Grand Pré is actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site. This is taken from their website. So it's really beautiful there. My family owned land on this dike for a couple hundred years. It was recently sold to a different farmer. But it is an area that receives a tremendous amount of tourism. It's an economic driver for this area of Nova Scotia. It's one of the 3 World Heritage Sites in Nova Scotia. It's a really interesting study in land use conflicts because farmers struggle with people walking their dogs, driving their bikes, driving their cars out on these dikes as they're trying to bring their combines out or do complaints about manure spreading in the spring and the number of flies that brings. So as we value our agricultural productivity, we're also doing things that makes it more difficult for the farmers to do their activities. And people also want to live around here. This is a very beautiful site. This picture does it complete justice. This is the Blomidon over here. It's a beautiful vista. It's a rural landscape within 45 minutes of Halifax. So these kind of land use conflicts are not managed very effectively by the provincial statements of interest. And I'm really interested in what they're doing in Ontario because it seems to be a much more integrated approach to understanding that it's more than just about the soil, it's also about the other contributors to make an agricultural community. So anyway, I think this is a good illustration of those marshlands, how they're being protected, but the other land use conflicts that are arising because of other pressures, particularly from the tourism industry or from the cultural heritage industry. So a few observations about agricultural policies in Nova Scotia. The delivery, it's left to the municipalities. I remember working for the County of Kings 15 years ago, and there was an old fella councillor who was involved with the initial regulation of agricultural land and all the really strict agricultural policies that were put in place. And he said it was one of the hardest things he ever did to get those policies in place, because farmers would come with tears in their eyes saying, you know, I can't retire if you don't let me sell off a lot or two. You know, so that's tough for local community members who are just trying to do a counselor job on, you know, as a part-time job on the side or after they retire, to have to manage that level of conflict without much support from the province. There's not a great deal of consistency between the municipal units in Nova Scotia. So on one side, you can do a lot of a boundary line, you can do a lot more than on the other. It also drives development elsewhere. Probably not so important right now in this economic and housing crunch that we're in, but 5-10 years ago it was. Municipalities didn't want housing or economic development to go somewhere else. They wanted trying to attract it to their municipal unit, but if you had strong agricultural policies, it was a disincentive for people to come to your particular county. The other benefits of agriculture are not recognized. So the tourism benefits, the ecological goods and services that agricultural lands provide, the rural community feel, the rural community structures are not recognized by the agricultural land preservation statement of interest from the province. And the landowner impacts. I was talking to a farmer once about this, and he said, why is agriculture on the back of farmers to protect? If it's worth protecting, then, you know, how can we spread the responsibility of this, not just on me, who takes my land value down so significantly, but it's spread throughout the community or the province as a whole. So it's complex. It's, in my opinion, as a planner, it's worth protecting these agricultural lands, but the regime needs to be a bit more developed and consistent. And I think Nova Scotia has lots of good things about it, but it's also a place where I think we need to work to continue to improve these policies. And I started this presentation off with a discussion of, you know, dad jokes and mom jokes, but so I'm going to have gratuitous pictures of my kids who are both in 4-H. And, you know, it is about having opportunities to have future generations be able to have a viable life in the agricultural industry, whether or not it's in sort of more traditional family farms, which is my background, but also in other value-added agricultural industries. And I think for our rural communities, that is an important consideration. So just to tell you, my son came second with his goat and my daughter came fifth. And this picture down in the corner is my daughter standing on those dikes in Grand Pré that we talked about. And that's a winter picture of Grand Pré, really important agricultural area. So with that, I think I will end, and I can't see anybody, but I hope it was interesting, and I'm happy to stick around and answer questions if desired.
That's great. Thank you very much, Crystal. In the interest of time, I just want to move swiftly on. Last but not least, Tracy Wade, with speaking about New Brunswick's approach to agricultural land use protection. Thank you.
Hi, everybody. It's Friday afternoon. I'm the last speaker. Woohoo! That was really great. It's actually really interesting that I'm last here out of the group because we're talking about New Brunswick, and New Brunswick is probably as close as anything to PEI in terms of where we are in protecting agricultural land, and we're baby steps behind Nova Scotia and probably several leaps behind what's going on in Ontario. So yeah, so my name's Tracy. I am in Sackville, New Brunswick. Been there for about 25 years. I did grow up in Ontario, weirdly in that Golden Horseshoe, well, I guess not weirdly, on a farm in the Golden Horseshoe. Moved out here and have spent most of my time working with rural communities and looking at how you do land use planning in the context of New Brunswick planning and how we deal with that. I'm just assuming this is all, yes. Okay, so just very briefly, I'm going to go through a couple of things, and I'm going to try and draw some connections between what we've heard too, because I think it also lays the groundwork for what's going to be happening here in PEI coming up. So we all know prime agricultural land is a valuable, non-renewable natural resource. So we always talk about trying to protect these non-renewable resources and use them wisely. Agricultural land is definitely one of them. So, and over the last century, as our first speaker was talking about, the development has taken place in some of the highest capability agricultural land in the country. I always say that it always seems to be, it's just, people consider it vacant land. It's there, just ready for development, whereas, no, it's actually active, being usable land, and when you change the use of it, it is pretty dramatic. So in New Brunswick, you saw a couple of maps earlier, only 4% of the land is being used to produce food right now. We're not known for our agricultural industry, but it is one of the big ones. We are known for resource development, forestry in particular, but agriculture is a really significant piece of that. Our province loses about 400 hectares of farmland each year to development, according to StatsCan, and between 2001 and 2021, farmland in New Brunswick declined by over 100,000 hectares. So that's a pretty significant, when we're only talking about 4%, that's a big drop in the amount of agricultural land. So of course the challenge with us is that, well, with anyone, is that resource development, including farming, is the backbone of the New Brunswick provincial economy, but incompatible land uses are contributing to the loss and fragmentation of prime agricultural areas. So it's limiting the opportunity to expand or to develop new farm operations. Infrastructure and communities are now built for the car, so that also means that we have all sorts of sprawl and ribbon development that's happening throughout New Brunswick. You can build, as long as you have an acre of land, you can build a house on it, generally speaking, in New Brunswick. And we know that there are inherent conflicts between people moving to the rural area for peace and tranquility and the farmers who actively work the land. I've been to so many public hearings where somebody is trying to rezone something and the neighbors come out, you can't allow whatever it is to go here. It's something very reasonable for a rural area. Because, I spent my life savings on this 1 acre piece of land so I could build my $300,000 back in 10 years ago, $500,000 home on it. You can't allow something that's resource related to happen here. Well, where else are we going to put it? Like, it's got to go somewhere, and it belongs in the rural area. So there is this conflict of people, the ex-urbanites who are kind of invading the rural space as well. There's also, of course, the conflict, and Crystal alluded to it, with farmers who are selling off their land for development. So it's whether or not that's their retirement package or it's a better deal to sell it off for 100 acres or even one lot than to sell it for agricultural land, because it's simply worth more in the development sense. So, of course, the more development that takes place in the rural areas, the harder it is to make a living in farming, and the harder it is to keep farmland for farming. So in New Brunswick, Ontario has kind of been the leader of developing these statements of provincial interest, provincial policy statements, they're called in Ontario. Nova Scotia, of course, Crystal talked about what they have there. So in the last year, the last 3 years, there's been a lot of stuff going on in New Brunswick. So first of all, there was a massive amalgamation process that took place. The entire province experienced amalgamations in one sort or another. We went from 400 individual entities, half of them being municipalities, little tiny municipalities, just out there, kind of like in PEI right now, and a whole bunch of unincorporated areas, to 70 municipalities and 12 rural districts. So now, I said I was in Sackville. That's not even true anymore. I'm in Tantramar. So Tantramar includes the town of Sackville, the village of Dorchester, Point Dubuque, right along Highway 16 there, and all the area in between that. So that is our new municipal entity. So now what's happening is that all those brand new municipalities have to create land use plans. But how do municipalities that don't even know their own area, quite frankly, how do they do that? So what happened is along with this local governance reform piece where we got new municipal boundaries, statements of public interest were also established. And so these big statements of public interest, very similar to what's in Ontario and in Nova Scotia, as well as Manitoba and Saskatchewan, they are meant to identify the public's interest and priorities for land use planning. And that, so these are things that are not supposed to be just, something that one municipality thinks is important and another one can ignore. These are things that are supposed to be considered consistently across the province. We all use that word consistent. It's a very important word in planning. So there are 5 SPIs that got adopted. One of them is on agriculture, and it's pretty short and it's aspirational. So it never tells you how to do it. Again, it's just about what you should achieve at the end of the day. So the agriculture SPI, it's actually more than about agriculture, it's food. Promote the agriculture, fishery, and aquaculture sectors and the production of food in the province. Simple. So specifically in that then, in the land use plans, we have to identify and protect prime agricultural areas and then separate, as best as we can, non-compatible uses from the prime agricultural areas using setbacks and reciprocal setbacks and land use planning tools. So that seems really simple. Okay, let's all do it. So I'm one of, 70 land use planners in the province of New Brunswick. By the way, I do not work for the province, so anyway, I too am quite free to speak and say what I want. Okay, so just to kind of step back then, so that's the kind of structure that we're dealing with. So again, land use planning, just generally speaking, it's about protecting the public interest, and in New Brunswick with the SPIs, it's ensuring there's enough agricultural land to produce food. It's not just for internal use, it's also for export as well. I think there was a statistic. In 1972, New Brunswick grew 95% of its food. We now grow 5% of our own food. Anyway, it just shows you how society has changed. Land use planning is one of the ways to reduce conflict and hopefully, and to protect prime production areas from development. So under the new regulations that were passed in the last couple of years, new land use plans are going to be required in every municipality by January 2028. So that's in less than 5 years, 4 years now. In New Brunswick, again, like in PEI, well, your municipalities were supposed to have land use plans, but the unincorporated areas, so that was 70% of New Brunswick before, didn't have to. Some of them did. We had some rural plans in a few of the areas, but for the most part, it was just, if you want a building permit, just go get a building permit. You don't even need a development permit. There's no rules about anything. So now, except for those rural districts, so say they take up 30% of the province, and they're literally, well, they're in the center of the province where most of the crown land is. So the rest, the 70% of the province, and most of it is, most of that would be where 98% of the people live in the province, will have land use plans now. These plans have to be consistent with the SPIs. And the other piece is that the local and regional planners are supposed to be working with the provincial experts and stuff in order to figure out how to do this. So one of the things, just before I get into a couple of the kind of my thoughts, is that the idea of how to determine what a prime agricultural area is pretty vague at the moment. I worked with the province to develop how to interpret the SPI statements, and the argument over how to identify prime agricultural areas was the biggest one we had. And I don't mean it was an argument, but it was the discussion that no one could figure out. The Lear stuff that goes on in Ontario is a really, really nice example, although the province chose not to go that route. But it makes a huge amount of sense to not just look at CLI. We certainly don't have any or class 1, 2, and hardly any 3 agricultural land in the province. We are very much a 4 to 7 province. So you can't depend on CLI. We can look at what service New Brunswick, what's already under agricultural production from a tax base. We can look at the Farmland Identification Program, which is a tax relief program that New Brunswick has, notoriously erroneous, so that's not a great one either. So trying to figure out the best way to have this thing where it protects agricultural land for the longer term is kind of where we're at right at the moment. So now that we're into this whole planning cycle, so planners and communities and local governments and all sorts are trying to figure out where we go from here. So what do the SPIs and everything mean for industry? Well, it means that we are going to be able to identify and hopefully protect prime agricultural areas. It's not just, a 5-acre piece of land we're talking about, but we're talking about those large contiguous areas that can support agricultural activity in the long term. Hopefully, there's going to be long-term protection of these areas from incompatible development and encroachment. So being very generous with what's an agricultural related use, again, similar to what was done in Ontario in all those permitted use lists, even what on-farm diversification opportunities. We don't have any rules about any of that stuff, but those are things that we still want to encourage because we recognize there's not a lot of, anyway, I recognize that there's a recognition that only farming on this land is probably not the way to keep the industry going. There's too many other factors going on. There hopefully also will be less development pressure on the prime agricultural areas. Again, we don't have much. So in order to protect what we've got, we really need to be aggressive about it. I don't know how it's all gonna pan out though. What it means for farmers. So at this point now, because we have local governments all over the province, which we never had before, farmers actually have a local council, local mayors to go to. They don't have to go knock on Fredericton's door and hope that somebody listens. They've got local elected councils that will help lead and hopefully work with them in that identification of the prime agricultural areas. And of course, the local council should be representing local interests, including farming, not just the few other people in their community centers. Hopefully, there'll be fewer land use conflicts, as there should be limited new development beyond what is compatible in the agricultural areas. There probably will be reduced ability to sell farm property, but I don't know if that's actually going to happen. But that should be, you shouldn't be able just to, if you're in one of these areas, subdivide your land into 100 residential lots and sell them because you can. So there should be some protection for that. And then land prices then should reflect agricultural uses. I respect what Crystal was talking about, how it's not fair that agricultural land is worth less than development land or speculation, land for speculation, but at the same time, for farmers to get into it, to expand and all that kind of stuff, it needs to be affordable. So there's got to be some kind of balance there. Just some final thoughts from me, and then we can go into a discussion. Again, prime agricultural land, it's non-renewable resource. Municipalities are going to be the ones, so similar to Nova Scotia, they are the ones that are going to have to figure out how to protect it so it can continue to produce food and that kind of thing, and that farmers need to participate in this process. I should throw in, though, New Brunswick, unlike Nova Scotia, threw in veto power for the Minister of Agriculture. So while municipalities are allowed to, or are expected to create their own land use plans, the Minister of Environment and Local Government can veto any decision that may impact what, it's usually he thinks is really key for the development of the province. So that was a huge controversial thing. Pretty sure it's mostly about forestry, to make sure municipalities don't ban clear cutting or glyphosate use or something like that. But anyway, the point is that there's a little bit of a balance there, although I don't know. None of this has been tested, so we're at the very beginning phase of this. So again, it kind of leads into maybe where PEI is going eventually. It'll be interesting to see how it works out. Again, they haven't been tested. Oh, the other thing is that no matter what, subdivisions are still permitted in pretty much every minor regulation in the province, anywhere. So it really, there needs to be some consistency with what's happening, and I believe those regs are being looked at now, but anyway, so again, we're very much in a transition phase. I'm a firm believer that land use planning is a tool that can help, but it is a long-term, it's a long-term end game. It is not something that's going to fix the situation overnight. So I think that's it.
Yes, so we're over time, but if anybody has any questions, the panel would be happy to answer those. There's microphones at both sides of the room, so if not, we might need to conclude, but I'll leave that to Tyler.
Just a quick question for John. The Lear model, was that adapted from somewhere else, John, or was that developed in Ontario?
It's on? Okay. Yeah, so originally, we've been using Lear on and off in Ontario going back to the early 1990s. So admittedly, it predates, I've been around a while, but it actually does predate me. But my understanding is we originally borrowed the idea from a model from the U.S. Department of Agriculture that they had put out for use in the U.S. I believe they referred to it as LISA, and I'm trying to remember. Land evaluation was part of it. I think it was site assessment. Yeah, I think that sounds familiar in terms of that. So, yeah, that model has history in the sense of it's been around a while. But yeah, we've adapted it and made some revisions to it to fit the Ontario context. And I think that's, not unusual in the world of land use planning to, borrow ideas from elsewhere and then tweak it to fit your circumstances as appropriate.
I guess the question for you, Alex, what's currently being done on PEI to protect farmland?
Yes, I'll speak very vaguely about this because I'm not sure in which capacity as a moderator I can get into it, but the two primary protections for ag land on PEI currently is through the Lands Protection Act, Lands Identification Regulations, which is an identification for a 10-year period that is designed to protect resource land, not just agriculture, but also forestry, and also the SPAs. That was one of the initial or original intents of the implementation of the special planning areas, but that only covers 7.7% of the island. So we have one initiative that is limited to geographic area and one that is limited to time, and it's not very equitable across the island for that reason.
For the others on the panel, do you think the Maritimes could and should share planning tools and regulations? Could or should, I guess.
So I guess I'm a big proponent of sharing things. As I kind of alluded to that with my answer about Lear, because I think we all kind of are facing the same issues and challenges in different, in different ways, in different contexts, but there's a lot to be learned from sharing. I know we do routinely reach out to our colleagues at other provinces to talk about land use issues. It is a little bit challenging to share in that sense because we all, not to get into a whole constitutional law discussion, but agriculture is uniquely both a provincial and federal responsibility, where land use planning is usually seen as very much a provincial responsibility. So provinces have different approaches. But that said, there's so much commonality. I think there is a benefit to talking and sharing, and I wish we did more of it. But yeah, that would be it's certainly a benefit when we talk to each other and learn.
I can guarantee you almost the first step in any thing that any province looks at is they do a jurisdictional review. They look at what's going on from BC to the north to Newfoundland, and you kind of just go, well, I kind of like what they're doing. Case in point, I mean, I don't know if I should admit this, when we were putting together the SPI user guide, so, you know, training people how to understand and implement the statements of public interest, we literally we cherry picked and went, I really like the way they did that one, I really like the way they did that one, and then of course it went through, because it's provincial government, 47 edits, and so anyway, it boiled down into something unique, but we absolutely do that, and you know, there's routinely, I'm sure, like conferences like this and networking are great opportunities to figure out the in quotes, best practices, good practices that are happening, so we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We never need to do that. So I think that's something we need to. Crystal.
I like that you looked up to me, Tracy. That just makes me feel good. So absolutely we need to share, but I do think that the agricultural situation in each community, in each province is quite different. So there needs to have the ability to respond to, I mean, farming in Saskatchewan is totally different than farming in Nova Scotia or on the island. So it's got to be robust enough system that it can respond to the provincial context, but also recognize that, you know, it's a big part of our national and provincial economies, and we need to think more about how we support the agricultural industry, not just farmers, but the value add industry on top of that and all the accessory and auxiliary stuff that happens. And that's, to me, that's a federal, the federal leadership is also important there.
It seems to me like this is much more complicated than agronomy, and I've hardly ever seen an issue as conflicted with all the different levels of government and private interests. Wow. But I guess my question is, I mean, I don't seem to see the utility, to be quite honest, of kicking a provincial reg down or provincial plan down to a municipal government for implementation, because they're so conflicted. Even farmers themselves are conflicted between their working lives and their retirement lives. And the local pressures must be immense. But so let's kick this to outside of Canada. Is there a place elsewhere in the world where they have great pressures on their agricultural land and they've done a particularly good job of dealing with it? And what is their secret sauce?
So I would say there's, to my experience, I have yet to find anyone who's doing a wonderful job elsewhere in the world. Now, but this is an issue everywhere. You know, I have colleagues that I connect with in Australia, in New Zealand, in Europe, certainly in the US. It's an issue everywhere. You're right, there is that challenge, will always be the challenge of everybody wears multiple hats in every aspect of their life. And at one moment, I may, as a farmer, think about the importance of the soils, and I may think about the importance of what it means to my business, but I also maybe think about what it means to my retirement. But then at the same time, I might turn around and think about what it means to, you know, my grandchild if there's somebody there, right? So it's a really challenging thing to wear multiple hats. The one thing I will say, though, is that when I started, we were working on the Greenbelt plan in Ontario. When that was happening, when we were doing the public consultation process on that, the largest group of objectors in the room were farmers. Absolutely were farmers. I'm being very careful and diplomatic here to not step into it as a public servant here and talk about the Greenbelt in Ontario right now. But what I will say is the largest group of organizations that stepped up and complained to the government about what was being proposed with the Greenbelt now were farmers. And I think that says something in the sense of, I think that it has maybe taken almost 20 years, but farmers have generally seen that there's a benefit. It doesn't necessarily mean it works for every farmer in every case in every circumstance, but as a community, farmers have seen a benefit. And if that wasn't the case, I don't think those farm organizations would have stepped up the way they did in the past year. So yes, it's complex. Yes, it doesn't necessarily work for everybody in every circumstance, but I think the option of doing nothing is just that much worse. That's what people are saying, well, let's do something as opposed to nothing.
So, and just outside of Canada, thought, I mean, in Europe, the value of agricultural land is, for agricultural purposes and for absolutely nothing else, is astronomical. I mean, there's just such a need for it and a recognition for it. But I think it has a lot to do with the way we've settled and developed life here in North America, to why we're in the situation that we're in. When you're in Europe, like the communities are they're very old, but there's a very tight center, and then there's agricultural land in those, like you don't get the haphazard development that you would get here, and certainly in the Maritimes, and even in Ontario to maybe a little bit lesser degree, but in New Brunswick for sure. Like there's just, everyone can just subdivide off an acre, an acre, and an acre. So there's houses everywhere. But in European centers, it's because we had so much land. It didn't matter at that point. But in Europe, it's like and I don't know the numbers or any statistics or anything, but in the Netherlands and in those really fertile lands in some of those countries, you can't afford to buy the agricultural land because it is so valuable there. So anyway, and there are huge protection measures. It would take 5 years to do a rezoning on a piece of property in agricultural land, and there's no guarantee you're ever going to get a rezoning there. So that's the comment that you hear from immigrants who've ended up in Canada, because they're like, oh, this is just so much easier to do whatever we want to do here. We've always been a little bit more, yeah, sure, we got lots of land, no problem.
I'm tempted to talk about Ireland because that's where I'm from, and I would agree that there's a high value placed on protecting agricultural land, and that was primarily done through establishing strict growth boundaries around villages and settlements. And if there was development to take place, it would happen on the periphery. So that's development speculation would here perhaps be coastal agricultural regions. That's where we're seeing a lot of the development pressure. But there it would be around the periphery of already established municipalities in the Canadian context. So yeah, I think that it's quite successful in the UK personally. Crystal, do you have anything to add to that?
I guess I would I think I agree with Tracy, and about I went over on a trade mission with FCM in the, 15, 20 years ago, and we visited a farm. And what was interesting is how that there was a conscious effort to ensure that density and growth and communities were located in such a way that it didn't encourage or discourage sprawl. I do think it goes back to the fact that we just have more land than we know what to do with for the most part, and how we have not sort of thought that we were ever running out of it. And I think it was stated, earlier, our best agricultural lands are around Winnipeg and around Toronto in that golden horseshoe, and there's not a recognition of our land use practices that promote density and keeping people in places and not allowing them to have their acre of heaven in the prime agricultural area is part of the challenge for us. So who's doing it better? People, I think Europe is, but they have their challenges too. And I would agree that this is a global challenge as we our soil conditions and our climate changes. We're going to have to be more mindful of this.
Yes, so if there's no more questions, we'll probably leave it there. We're 25 minutes over our allotted time, but thank you all. Does anybody from the conference want to wrap up, or appreciate your time and your attending? Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much for that discussion. I guess that wraps up our conference for this year. I'd like to thank everyone for coming, and just once again, if you could drop your surveys off at the door and your name tags, that'd be great. Hopefully everybody has a safe trip home. Thank you very much.